Are you a woman who's wanting to get ahead? Well, did you know that there are some unexpected and hidden barriers that are stopping you from realizing your worth? And that's what we're going to be talking together today on this episode. Hello, lovely ladies, and welcome to the Dynamic Women podcast. I'm Diane Ralston, your host. And today we have Commissioner Kadie Ward with us. Hi, Kadie.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so happy to have you because this is a topic that is passionate on my heart. And I know it's so important for our community and all the women. We're going to talk about women's worth, challenging the status quo. That's can we do that in just one episode? I don't know.
I don't know. It's probably a series.
Yeah, we'll do our best. And the amazing thing is that this is what you do for a living. This is your calling. This is the purpose that you have. So why don't we start off? You tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thank you. Currently, I'm Commissioner and CAO of Ontario's Pay Equity Commission, and I'll talk about what we do at the Commission. My background is international economic development, foreign affairs, and trade. And I started getting involved in getting women involved in global trade. So Canada, if you don't know, has a Feminist International Assistance Policy. And a lot of work I was doing was sponsored by the government of Canada to get women in sort of labor markets, in economic development, and also into global trade. And that really kind of put me on the path to being curious about how we do more of this, because it was obviously a challenge, not just here in Canada, but globally.
Yeah.
So I had an opportunity to work about 100 cities in 30 different countries, doing different types of work, but also always with a focus on women and getting women into the economy and the labor market. So when I moved back to Ontario, it just seemed like a really great fit to move into the pay equity space and look more deeply at the issues or challenges women face in the labor market and sort of that's realizing their economic potential.
Yeah. Wow. Now, audience, I do have to point out a couple of things. Kadie's super humble here. She has won the Queen's Diamond Jubilee medal. And also she's won the Gold Quill Award of Merit for Excellence in Government Communications. So Kadie, tell us a little bit more about both of these really acknowledgements to your work.
Sure. Yes. I don't like to brag, not even humble brag, but thank you for asking. The Queen's Diamond Jubilee was a really wonderful award to win. I was nominated by colleagues in the economic development field, and the specific category of that award was excellence in economic development for Canadian cities. So it was just recognizing the contributions I made to cities across Canada, growing their economies, basically growing their local economic development outreach. So that was a really wonderful medal to get.
Yeah.
The Gold Quill is, I'd say it's more of a team effort. Our team recently launched it's a podcast series, but it's a campaign, education campaign called Level the Paying Field. And we'll talk about that because there would never be an uneven playing field, right? Like you just wouldn't go and see a soccer pitch tilted in favor of one team. And so, but that's how it is. That's how the labor market is. It is tilted in favor of a certain gender. So that was a campaign we ran, and it was recognized by this International Association of Business Communicators. And that was a really wonderful affirmation that our team is doing great work, and that as a leader, I'm pushing the organization in the right direction to be doing this type of outreach that's going to help women understand their worth and ultimately level the paying field.
Yeah, amazing. And also I wanted you to talk about those is because we don't always see women achieving or hear of them achieving really greatness. And I want there to be maybe some of this will spark in someone who's listening to this, will spark in them that like, cool, maybe I could get that. Or maybe it'll also spark someone nominating a woman for one of these awards moving forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome. So, I'd love to be educated here a little bit more about what is the Pay Equity Office. And maybe you can tell a little bit about the role of the office that it has in women's work. And as we're talking about women's worth.
Right. Well, the Pay Equity Office is an agency of the government of Ontario. Ontario was the first government globally, believe it or not, to have a Pay Equity Act. And pay equity looks at a specific idea called equal pay for work of equal value. So a lot of governments cover equal pay for equal work. So if men and women or any person identified as any gender is working on a manufacturing line and they're moving widgets down the line, they're doing the same work, so they have to be paid the same amount of money.
Yes.
What pay equity does is says, listen, women have historically been clustered in certain types of jobs, and those jobs were undervalued because they were held by women. So we need to look at value for value comparisons. So how do we say that a janitor, which is typically male dominated in a school, provides more value than a secretary that is typically female dominated?
Yeah.
So we have a gender neutral job comparison system where we actually look at gender neutral criteria. It's pretty complex regression analysis, but we go through it and we show that if jobs have equal value, but they're paid differently because there's a gendered predominance of certain job classes, then companies are forced to correct that. And in fact, every company in Ontario has to have a pay equity plan. So it's quite robust. Our office administers that. Just because I know you're at least Canada-wide, there are other provinces that have a Pay Equity Act. Quebec has one, PEI and Nova Scotia, but theirs is more focused on public sector, not private.
Okay.
Newfoundland is in the process of creating one. So there's different ways of addressing inequity in pay. Pay Equity Act is a very strong statement, but it could also be covered under human rights or different labor codes throughout Canada. So most provinces, I would say every province has some kind of tool to address pay inequity.
Yeah. And I'm glad this is coming up because we hear a lot about equality in the number of women in certain roles, in certain industries, but to know that there are people like you fighting for us to actually get the same amount of pay, even if we're in a mainly female dominated industry. I know I've spoken for early childhood educators. That's like 95% female when I've been there. So to know that there's that happening by the government is really good. Now, if we can switch to, if you can share your insights on how we got here.
Sure. It's a good question.
And then I'm curious about the challenges that keep women out or down in the labor force. There's maybe two questions there you can tackle.
No, I love it because they're interrelated. And I think this is the biggest point that is missed by policymakers or people who are in this equity space when they're trying to think about how do we correct this or level this, is they forget how entrenched these sort of systems are. So, I mean, for me to talk to you about how did we get here, I would actually take you, back 8,000 to 10,000 years to the sort of agricultural revolution. And there's a great author, Dr. Deborah Spar. She's written a lot about this. And she has a famous quote that says, patriarchy began with the plow. And she goes into a really interesting anthropological history about technology and agriculture and farming and how when we were, and I'll start there, but I'll skip a couple of centuries so we can have a decent conversation.
Good.
But with the invention of the plow, our whole lifestyle, our whole cultural changed. And before the plow, anthropologists have recognized that women were 50% economic contributors to their nomadic tribes. What that means is the primary economic activity of these tribes was gathering food, because that's how they survived. They moved around to gather food with seasons, right? So women contributed 50% of that. There was a sort of economic equality in what was contributed, and there was a vital, important role that both played. When you move into an agricultural setting, what you're doing is you're stopping, you're setting down, and you're working the land. And so all of a sudden, land ownership becomes really important, because if you're pouring your labor into it, you want to make sure that you're going to get the harvest. So a couple of things happen here. One, the creation of private property, all of this interesting stuff, but around gender and women and labor, women become really important because they're producing labor. It sounds really crude to say, but the only way of getting labor back then was to produce it through childbearing or to steal it. And sadly, this is where slavery often emerges, right?
Yeah.
But the strangest thing happens because women are creating life, values, super powerful, incredible thing that women can do. But somehow during this process, they're subjugated and controlled, because you want to control those reproductive rights, because you need to show that that child is yours, because they're going to inherit the land and they're going to continue to own it after you. So there's a really interesting shift that happens when we start to settle and become an agricultural society around gender and gender norms and structures. So I could say a lot more there, but I'm going to skip to the Industrial Revolution because we don't have a lot of time. And I would say that for, pretty much thousands of years, the structure kind of stayed the same, even though societies and things change. We still kind of had this agrarian economy. We had mercantile class rise up that were doing trade and things like that. And we had serfdom, all these interesting things happen. But really that gendered dynamic of women producing labor and staying home and being sort of docile stayed until really the Industrial Revolution. And what's interesting about the Industrial Revolution is up until that, there's a great quote that says, up until the Industrial Revolution, a woman's place was in the home, but so was everyone else's. The home was the primary economic unit, right? There's a farm, there's a farming family, you were in a community, you went to local markets to trade. What happens though is with industrialization, jobs are created outside the home. And in fact, it was primarily women and children that worked in these manufacturing plants. Now we know they weren't great working conditions. It was pretty awful. There was a lot of advocacy around getting especially children and protecting children. But what ends up happening is this is a paid labor market, and men go, it's better jobs. That's a better job. My wife or my sister is leaving the house and going to the factory and getting paid. And I'm working the land and I'm farming, and it's so much blood, sweat, and tears. And I'm trading something at the market. So as this dynamic starts to change and the better jobs are emerging in the industrialized spaces, and the machinery becomes more difficult and things are changing, men start to become the more dominant labor force, and women stay home and start to take care of the hearth and the home, because it's still, if you're not living in a city, you still have to manage some kind of, homestead. Yes. So there's this unequal right there distribution. But when women were always in the labor market, I think we need to recognize this. They were always in the labor market at some point, if they were caring for children or the home, or doing types of domestic work that women have been clustered into. But what happens is primarily only unmarried women enter the labor market, the paid labor market. And I say paid labor market because women have always worked. If it was at the home, it was still work. It wasn't paid in the labor market sort of, but it's labor. We know that as
I have two jobs. I have my business, and then I'm a mom of two.
Exactly. So it's labor. So I say paid labor market to bring attention to the fact that's how much unpaid labor mostly women do. But it was unmarried women that were in the labor market because social conventions at the time really didn't allow for married women to work. Okay. And here's what's really interesting. And this is the sort of like, here's where it started with the agricultural revolution, but here's where it gets interesting, is there were laws and policies that prescribed the type of work women could do. And these are all men making the laws. And the salaries were also set lower than men's because they believed that women were not breadwinners. They didn't need to take care of a family, so they didn't need to make as much money as men, which I'm pretty sure that, in the 18th, 19th century, there were single moms out there, but the employer labor market wouldn't recognize that. So that's a really important piece, I think, for women to recognize and policymakers to recognize that from the beginning, the labor market never had equal access. There were jobs that women were prescribed that only women could do because of their sensibilities or whatever. And then their salaries were set lower from the beginning because of social constructs about women's worth and women's values. And this is where it starts to get interesting and things speed up for women and equality and equity conversations, because women start to demand equal pay for equal work. That first idea saying, well, we're both on the line moving widgets. Why aren't we getting paid the same?
Exactly.
But those demands start to change, and governments respond, by the way, with policy that addresses that. But then women start to say, wait a minute, it's not just equal pay for equal work. They bring in the concept of equal value, which I explained at the beginning, where we're doing different work, but that's because the policies shaped the type of work we can do. We could do historically. Now, that's changing now, but we're doing different work, but that work is not valued fairly. And so the argument shifted in that direction. And I think this is where we're at today, to kind of bring it home, is that we're at that space where we're saying, wait a minute, the historic clustering is starting to fall apart. You see more women entering, say, applied sciences like mathematics, engineering, even skilled trades. And you see that sort of historical clustering start to fall apart, and that's affecting the wage sort of discrimination. But you're also seeing the conversation saying, well, but just because women were clustered in, say, clerical work or care work or cashiering or these types of very service-driven jobs, we shouldn't be undervaluing those. We should recognize the value they bring to an organization and to the economy. So this is where we're at today, is kind of challenging those norms of, or at least recognizing like, hey, it was never level to begin with, so we have to restructure the way that we actually approach talking about women's contributions to the economy.
Yeah. So, audience, have you heard that a lot of these worth things aren't even our fault because they were put in there in the beginning?
Well, I love that. I'm going to jump in on that, because even with the gender wage gap, a lot of the explanations we hear are, well, women don't negotiate, women take more time off for maternity leave, women don't apply for the jobs, blah, blah, blah. And it puts the problem back on women, like it's your fault.
Be better, do more.
Exactly. And I like to, that's just myth bust that, because in fact, women do actually negotiate. They just don't get the raises. And it's actually, they're seen as norm breakers because women are supposed to be agreeable and all of these things. So that's just not true. And the problem is not with women's behavior in the labor market. The problem is that the labor market, has these sort of historical policies and structures that are very hard to break. I mean, they're changing. It takes time, but it also, I think women need to recognize that, we've always been there. It's just we haven't valued the worth.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and as I love to ask my guests, can you please share some concrete solutions, practical examples that will work to really level that playing field, or the paying field, as you call it?
Yes, exactly. Well, for people who are listening, who run a business, who are senior managers, who are in HR, you don't even have to be in HR, just any type of management position, you can do a pay equity audit on your organization. And I would direct people to the Ontario Pay Equity Office website. We have a toolkit. It's DIY. You could do it yourself. It goes through the 7 steps. It's a pretty complex process, but we make it very easy. You plug and play numbers and we figure it out for you. So that's a really concrete thing you can do, is just do a pay equity audit and see if you have unconscious pay discrimination. Because what we find is when we talk to businesses, we do the audits, they see the pay discrimination. It's often it's unconscious. They go, oh my God, because it's just the social norms, right? Of like, well, we can offer women lower because they'll say yes, or we can do these things. So that's a great exercise that people can take away from this and do it, or bring it to their leadership team if you're not in a position to do it yourself. The other thing is,
can I just ask first, this, you said it's on the Ontario site, but anyone from Canada, from the States, any country can benefit from doing this, because it's really plugging in the numbers and getting the feedback, right?
Absolutely. Anybody can use the tool or walk through the steps. It's specific to our process, but it's a pay equity analysis. So it's useful. Great question. We know that closing the gender wage gap, for instance, is linked to just closing broader gender gaps. And what I mean by broader gender gaps is participation, more women in the labor market, or more diversity, be that sort of intersectional or just plain gender diversity. We know that we see massive impacts to the bottom line to companies when they have this type of I'm sure you've covered this in multiple different podcasts. I don't need to get into it, but look at and challenge the way that you treat diversity as an organization, and bringing diversity of thought to the table. Not just, sometimes we get kind of, fall into tokenism of making sure we have certain
one of this nationality, one of this age range, or
no, it's diversity of thought that we need to think about. People who've had different experiences that we bring to the table. And I would say, in general, start challenging the status quo, start interrupting sexism. When you hear somebody in your workplace say something that's just like not appropriate, or it's sexist, or it's offensive to you, like, speak up in a polite way. This doesn't have to be confrontational. For me, my tactic is kind of polite, calling it out, friendly ways, so people can learn and see. Because I think in many of these cases, it's not always intentional. I don't think people set out to be, not everybody sets out to be really crude about this. So I think if you approach it in a way that's just seeking to raise awareness, you can make a lot of positive change.
Yeah, I like that you come at it from an informative, kind, sometimes humorous way. People don't need to be put on the chopping block for things. And a lot of times it's lack of education.
Yes.
And we're changing generational ideas and thoughts and what's been passed down to them. So I love your approach to this, and that it's not just for the owner. There are things that everyone listening to this can do in their workspace, in the boardroom, even if they're running their own business, in their business meetings with others. There are things that you've just shared that they can do, which is great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So final thoughts here, Kadie. I know we've covered a lot of ground, but what's your final message to those here today?
Final message, I'm going to share a really short anecdotal story that makes a point. When I was working in economic development, I had the chance to work with the team that led the Bryant Park restoration in New York City. It's a park downtown, and it was a really squalid, crime-ridden park that, after hundreds of millions of investment, finally turned. And I said, what was the turning point to the team? And the team answered, women. When women made up at least 55 or more % of park patronage, crime dropped and cleanliness increased. And so it really was a powerful message for me to say, like, just women's presence makes a difference. When a woman walks her child through that park, she's signaling to all the other women, it's safe, you belong here, and it's a safe spot for your family and for you to be. And I think that's just so powerful to say, women, like, be present. Just your presence actually changes what's happening around you. And I think when you step into the consciousness of that, like, hey, I'm here and I'm affecting what's happening around me, you step more into your worth, and you understand the value that you bring.
Exactly. So everyone, where are you going to take up space and be more present in your life? And that's also going to increase your worth, put other ladies in the position to be there, and then increase their worth as well. I love it. Thank you so much, Kadie, for sharing with us today, for all your knowledge, for the generous offering of mentorship or career conversation that you're giving others, and just continue to do the great work that you're doing. I really appreciate that we have amazing, powerful women out there doing this work, because it's not what I'm doing. So I appreciate that you're doing it in your own way. Thank
you so much. And thank you for bringing together a community of dynamic women.
Thank you. So for all of you who are listening, now is the time to hit the share button. Share this powerful episode with those around you, with your workplace, with other women in your life, so that they get to hear the messages that Kadie was sharing today, and the education. I got educated today as well. And also, if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, because you don't want to miss out on future solo episodes for me, or when I bring in other powerful, dynamic women to be our guests. And if you haven't written a review yet, now's your time. One other place that I love to be with dynamic women is the online Facebook group, the community, Dynamic Women Online Community. So search us out and join. It's free, and that's where we get to keep the conversation going. Until next time, everyone, stay dynamic. Bye.